Mr. Monday Night, Mr. Pay-Per-View, Mr. Thursday Night, Mr. Money in the Bank. Rob Van Dam has borne many nicknames through his illustrious career inside the ring that closes in on 3 full decades, but the only one that's come to define him most is not one you could bust out around the dinner table. It's the whole effing show, a phrase he coined in response to somebody else calling themselves the showstopper. Whether physically or verbally, Van Dam would never settle for sitting a rank below somebody else. Recently, RVD signed a deal with Impact Wrestling and has already shown to be just about every bit the hyper-elastic showman that he was in his mid-20s. You know, when he was turning the wrestling business on its ear as a boastful prodigy. Success and fame beckoned the highest of the high flyers, and even as his age creeps up, Van Dam continues to enthrall in his usual style. And with him kicking off a new chapter with Impact Wrestling, what better time than now to take a closer look at one of pro wrestling's all-time most unique performers. A man whose world-class agility is forever equaled in abundance by his relaxed confidence. I'm Sam from Cultaholic.com, and here are 10 things you didn't know about Rob Van Dam. Join us! Number 10, a real tough guy. It's been well established that Van Dam's trainer was none other than the original Sheik Ed Farhat, whose nephew Sabu has been a longtime friend and partner of RVD. Now, having one of the scariest wrestling greats of all time as your mentor gives you a fair amount of credibility on its own, but in his youth, Van Dam studied far more disciplines than just the ins and outs of pro wrestling. In case you couldn't tell from what Jerry Lawler would call his educated feet, Van Dam is quite the martial artist. As a young man, Van Dam took up several different martial arts disciplines, including karate, taekwondo, aikido, kendo, and even kickboxing, studying them all at several different dojos. And Van Dam took his studies so seriously that in his late teens, just before getting started as a pro wrestler, he entered a heavyweight tough man contest in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and ended up placing in second. So don't let the mellow, easygoing demeanor fool you. If you do manage to get RVD out of his well-centered place, he'll happily and easily hand your ass back to you. Number 9, brush with greatness. As far as ring attire goes, Van Dam is certainly one of the more sharp-dressed in the wrestling industry, putting on display a cornucopia of vivid singlets for more than 2 decades. The splashes of multicolour and the creative designs follow in the footsteps of Rick Rude's custom airbrush tights. Though Van Dam's attire tended to boast more of yin-yang symbols, skulls, dragons, and other mythical and spiritual properties. Van Dam's personal airbrush guy is a man named Joe Holland, the owner of Classic Graphics Incorporated out of Savannah, Georgia since 1985. For nearly a quarter century, he's been Van Dam's go-to for unique and distinct singlet designs that he's worn for various promotions. Though Holland's involvement in professional wrestling doesn't go much further than designing Van Dam's gear, RVD revealed in a 2012 interview that Ryback personally reached out to him for permission to seek Holland's services for his own tights. Fans have long noticed the similarities between Van Dam and Ryback's singlets, so there you go, that's the reason. Number 8, the whole Frozen show. Van Dam's unique style opened the eyes of a lot of promoters and bookers who coveted having such a one-of-a-kind athlete on their roster, especially one with so much upside. At different times in the 90s, WCW and WWE both courted Van Dam. WCW actually booked him for several months in '93 under the name Robbie V. But ECW managed to clutch onto him for a solid 5-year stretch. One particular overture made by WCW, according to Van Dam, would have probably necessitated him wearing something else instead of his singlet. As Van Dam tells it, WCW wanted to make use of his rapid-fire kicks and cultured martial arts background by turning him into a Mortal Kombat-like character. Van Dam apparently turned down the pitch that would have made him Glacier instead of Ray Lloyd way back when. And after Van Dam passed on the offer, he was told by WCW that there'd be more characters along the lines of Glacier, and he could be one of them under a mask. So could Van Dam have been Reptile, Sonya Blade, a red-eyed brute like Kano, the whole effing Goro with prosthetic arms? We may never know for sure. Number 7, Everywhere Man. Back when ECW was taking their unflinching alternative show national, Van Dam was one of its star players, even if his character was taking a decidedly anti-ECW stance come the spring of '97. It appeared that the man who was calling himself Mr. Monday Night was about to take an offer with WCW, only for it to apparently fall through. Instead, he showed up on Raw that May as a protege of Jerry Lawler, who himself was at war with ECW. Was this a storyline? Was there any reality to this unorthodox angle? Well, according to Van Dam, he was leaning toward jumping to WCW, but Heyman concocted a plan. His idea was for Van Dam to somehow appear on Nitro without a signed contract, then through Paulie's WWE connections appear on Raw, while remaining loyal to ECW, putting lots of attention on the rising promotion and its barnstorming superstar. The WCW part never came to fruition due to that unsigned contract, but Van Dam did jump between ECW and WWE for a spell, adding a little bit more I do as I please coolness to one of wrestling's most interesting characters. Number 6, quite a stretch. For most of us at Cultaholic, okay, all of us without exception, watching anybody do a split is enough to make us grimace so hard that we accidentally induce migraines and start hardcore vomiting all over ourselves. We understand that Van Dam's more flexible than any rubber band or spring, but sometimes watching him demonstrate that insane flexibility is enough to send a chill up our collective spines. Especially when he does his own special lift. Van Dam invented his own weightlifting technique known simply as the Van Dam lift. To execute it, he does a full split across 2 benches or chairs, then proceeds to lift a dumbbell from the floor up to his waist, while his groin muscles get pulled to their absolute limits. Even Stretch Armstrong would faint at the sight of it. And both the United States and International All-Round Weightlifting Associations allowed the Van Dam lift into their rulebooks. A man named Ujjwal Thakuri holds the world record for greatest weight lifted doing the move. A little more than 142 pounds. That's like Dalsum's flexibility combined with Zangief's power. Number 5, extreme absence. In 2014, a WWE.com article ranked Van Dam as the greatest star in the history of ECW, and it's a pretty arguable point. Van Dam's 23-month run of dominance as the company's television champion, which only ended due to a freak injury, made him the company's franchise player with or without the ECW title. When the ECW brand started up in 2006, Van Dam was awarded the championship on the spot, a nod to his status as the undisputed top guy on the show. But what's sometimes lost to history is that Van Dam never held the big belt when ECW was a standalone promotion. In his 5 years with the company, Van Dam had that near 2-year TV title reign, as well as multiple tag title runs with Sabu, but never sat atop the ECW mountain. Instead, the likes of Raven, the Sandman, Shane Douglas, Taz, and others ruled the roost, while Van Dam stole the show with his own belt. RVD was being groomed for the spot, but it unfortunately never came to be, thanks to injuries and the sands of time running out on the promotion come 2001. Number 4, Mellow Tuning. For most of his career, Van Dam's had some pretty cool theme music, generally in the realm of harder rock that contrasts his placid attitude. Pantera's Walk, as well as the bastardized Kilgore knockoff come to mind, as does his WWE theme of Breaking Point's One of a Kind, which he actually appeared in the music video for. Those songs are pretty great and are downright godly when compared to his TNA theme. You know, the one with the repetitive solitary guitar riff and shouted phrases like Rob Van Dam and so forth. TNA has had a long history of lackluster entrance themes, one knockoff after another with mediocre production and the utter lack of big event feel. But this one wasn't their fault. As it turns out, the exceedingly basic music RVD used in TNA was actually the theme song of his old RVD radio series, which began in 2008. The song is done by friends of his, a band called Cushionator, obviously, which saved TNA the hassle of having to bang out a poor man's version of Walk for the fans to shout along to. Number 3, last of his kind. Between WWE, ECW, and TNA, Van Dam held a total of 21 championships covering a near 15-year stretch, a tribute to his longevity and residual fame. But when you look back at Van Dam's most significant title victories and reigns, what stands out the most? Is it pinning John Cena at the Hammerstein Ballroom to become WWE champion at long last? Maybe the aforementioned 23-month TV title reign? And how about his time as IC champion during much of 2002 and 2003? Sometimes lost to history is Rob Van Dam's time as WWE European Champion, because the belt was thrown to the wolves the second that he won it. In July 2002, the European title was decommissioned and absorbed into the Intercontinental Gold when Rob Van Dam defeated Jeff Hardy in a special ladder match on Monday Night Raw. Technically, Van Dam's also the final WWE Hardcore Champion, defeating Tommy Dreamer the night after SummerSlam 2002 to absorb that belt into his IC title. It's sometimes forgotten that Van Dam was the man who ended 2 belts that were staples of the Attitude Era. Number 2, Mr. Mania Night. In 2002, Van Dam made his WrestleMania debut when he defeated William Regal to capture the first of 6 Intercontinental Championships for himself. 4 years later, another milestone victory came RVD's way, when he outlasted 5 other men in a Money in the Bank ladder match, earning the briefcase that he would later cash in on Cena. Rob Van Dam doesn't often get mentioned in the pantheon of other WrestleMania legends, but his record says that he should be. If you only count pay-per-view matches, Van Dam currently has the most wins at WrestleMania without a loss. Thanks to Undertaker's streak killer against Brock Lesnar, Van Dam's 4-0 mark is the current high score. His other wins include a 4-way tag victory at Mania 20 and an 8-man tag win at 23. As noted, this is for pay-per-view matches only, so his pre-show match loss in a tag title match at 19 doesn't count. The only other wrestlers with at least 3 WrestleMania wins without a single loss include the Legion of Doom, Demolition Axe, and Sable. That's quite the group. And number 1, Rarefied Heights. What a sight it was to see Van Dam holding both the ECW and WWE championships at the same time in 2006. Yes, both belts were under the jurisdiction of the same McBoss, but it was a surreal image nonetheless. The man once believed by many to be a guaranteed world champion on some distant day now had 2 at once. Eventually, he'd add a third different belt to the mix, the TNA World Heavyweight title, which he'd hold for 4 months. To date, Rob Van Dam is the first and only person to have held the WWE, ECW, and TNA World Heavyweight titles. A number of wrestlers have competed 2/3 of that puzzle, namely the WWE legends that TNA couldn't wait to put their belt on, Van Dam included. But some like Mick Foley and Kurt Angle both fell short of the trifecta due to never holding the ECW title, which both had a legitimate chance at different times. The phrase one of a kind is often associated with Van Dam because of his old theme music, but when it comes to feats like this, those words ring especially true.
Thanks for watching. Let us know what you think in the comments below. You can follow Cultaholic on Twitter at Cultaholic. You can check us out on Facebook at facebook.com/Cultaholic. If you like what we do here at Cultaholic, you can check us out on Patreon at patreon.com/Cultaholic. And no matter what you do, don't ever forget to hit subscribe and join us.